Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is March 16th, 2026, 12:46 p.m. So this post is going to be about my friend Ralph McGehee, a former CIA case officer who wrote a critical memoir of his days at the CIA. In fact, in the 20th century, he was one of four who did that, and he was the last of the four who did that. And this will be about Ralph and my relationship with Ralph. I've written about Ralph before, plenty, Substack, other places. Again, the accompanying post, a Substack links to all this. Ralph was born in 1928, Illinois, and his father supported the family as a janitor. And Ralph was raised Baptist, but he was a football player, star football player, and some of his football player buddies convinced him to go with them and enroll at the Catholic Notre Dame. And so Ralph went to Notre Dame. And when he attended from 1946 to 49, Notre Dame didn't lose a game and won three national championships. In fact, Ralph won awards and all-star games, this kind of thing. And in his book, at the beginning of his book, Ralph wrote that his most emotionally exalted moments came before the kickoff at the games. And it just filled Ralph with a patriotic fire, and so Ralph drank the Kool-Aid of American nationalism, Protestant work ethic, and these kind of things, especially during those days of peak American global dominance. And Ralph got a degree with honors in business administration. And after college, Ralph actually tried out for the Green Bay Packers. Didn't make it, but he tried out with them and then became a football coach in Dayton, where many years later I would live. And after a year of coaching, Ralph actually became a management trainee at Montgomery Ward in Chicago. And then one day he was contacted by the CIA. And they didn't advertise themselves that way initially. And in fact, Ralph had never even heard of the CIA at that time. But back then, fighting communism was the USA's national religion. So, anyways, he got recruited by the CIA. And then they went through a whole battery of, lie detectors and psychological testing and this kind of stuff. And Ralph IQ is about mine. He had a 143 IQ, which was more than adequate for what he was going to be. However, he was too thoughtful. So they'd give him scenarios, et cetera. And what they were really looking for, in fact, Ralph was a prize recruit, being this, all-American boy, football player for the national champions, et cetera. And privately, the CIA management referred to people like Ralph as mesomorphs and guerrillas. So they sort of ran the paramilitary operations of the CIA. And so they just wanted guys who followed orders. And so Ralph, and they thought in black-white terms, Ralph was a little too thoughtful. And in the end, a little too decent. But yeah, he was ultimately a hiring failure. Yeah, he thought too much and was too decent. Eventually, again, it took a long time for Ralph to wake up, but he eventually did. Anyway, so then he became this gung-ho Cold Warrior, hired in 52. And he spent years at his headquarters in Langley. In fact, had a house there in Herndon, which is, again, the burbs of Washington, D.C. And when he wasn't at headquarters, and so he would, his whole career in the field was spent in Asia, and then he'd be back at Langley between stints. And when Ralph was overseas, it was China, Japan, the Philippines, and Thailand, where he served. And it was during his second stint in Thailand in 1965 to 67 when he had his career's greatest success. And what he did was that, again, the British had their own intelligence stuff happening in that part of the world earlier. and of course, the United States taking over the empire. Um, Ralph built on a method of intelligence gathering that the British had used in Thailand, and to expose communist infiltration in the villages of northern Thailand. Um, and Ralph came up with this strategy. It was Machiavellian, so it was. I think Ralph regretted what he did, and threatening to kill people, etc. But it was tame for the times because anti-communist back then, or anti-communist efforts back then, if you were a suspected communist, you could get boiled in oil and suffer other grim fates. So Ralph's Ralph's method was relatively gentle. And his program was wildly successful, and he became the celebrated hero at the top of his game. This was the peak of Ralph's career when he had basically exposed the communist infiltration in northern Thailand and reversed its inroads. And so this was a big deal. And William Colby. So William Colby, he ran the Far East desk there, the CIA. So he was Ralph's ultimate boss there at the CIA at the time. And he visited Ralph. So in the wake of these accolades, etc., for Ralph's program, Ralph briefed Colby, and this was really the beginning of Ralph's awakening, I would say. And this was 15 years into his career. In fact, in Ralph's book, he mentioned how oblivious he was to the suffering of the people in the nations where he served the CIA. And anyway, so he briefed Colby, and as he's briefing Colby on what the findings were, one of the chief thing he wanted to tell Colby was that the intelligence that he had gathered in Thailand was at variance with what the CIA's official stance was and the American government's stance. So at that time, the communists portrayed these evil people, and they only got cooperation of the peasants through terrorism and this kind of thing. And Ralph's effort revealed that wasn't true at all. He found that the communists spent all their effort in winning peasant support, such as helping them get in the harvest, this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, the visitors loved to see the communists coming. They were friendly. They were buddies. And so it really was at variance with the official stance on how these communists are these evil people. And as Ralph was telling Colby this, Colby reacted. Ralph was actually surprised, but Colby's reaction was he was oppressed. He wasn't happy to receive this. In fact, at one point he said, "We seem to always be losing." So yeah, so the communists were winning the hearts and minds, truly, of the peasants there in northern Thailand. And it turned out this was all over Southeast Asia. This is the communist strategy, and it was very successful, which was the problem that the United States was trying to remedy by killing millions of people. So anyway, basically Ralph came up with the wrong answer. So this was, it was a brilliant program, etc., but the answer was not the one that the American government, the CIA, was promoting to justify slaughtering communists and their supporters. And so anyway, so what happened was Ralph's program was canceled almost immediately. This is a highly successful program, and then he ended up getting shipped back to a meaningless desk in Langley. And Ralph was bewildered. He didn't know what had happened. Like what's going on? And so Ralph was still so gung ho. He volunteered for Vietnam in '68, and this is post-Tet Offensive. I mean, nobody's saying in the United States was going to volunteer for Vietnam back then, but Ralph was such a true believer. And so, he signed up. He signed up to go to Vietnam, and then in October of '68, he ended up there in Saigon. Colby. So Colby was, again, Ralph's ultimate boss at the time, but he eventually, soon thereafter, he ran the CIA. So he ran the CIA. And in fact, and this is when the CIA was getting dragged through the mud in the '70s with the Church and the Pike committees. And Colby, as the head of the CIA at the time, he actually testified on Capitol Hill. And this is all very famous testimony. And about the CIA. In fact, this is really the only time the CIA has been exposed like it was. And Ralph watched, so he was on TV watching Colby testifying at these hearings, and Ralph was amazed at what a accomplished liar Colby was. Yeah, Colby would tell what Ralph knew were outright lies, and he would tell like some farmer talking about the crops. He just came across as this honest guy. Well, it turned out that he was, how to say it, he was a little more forthcoming than than the White House wanted, and so they canned him and replaced him with an even better liar, George Bush the first. So yeah. And in fact, Colby actually comes in my world. He came up again. In fact, he died. So back in the 90s, he actually, in fact, Stephen Greer, Disclosure Project guy, he alleges, and I'll buy it, that Colby actually contacted his organization and was going to try to transfer some of the exotic technology to them, and seed money, which my friend saw this technology, many years later. And so, or I'm sorry, before that, he saw this exotic technology. Um, and a few days after Colby allegedly contacted Gur's organization, he was found floating in a river, a tributary to the Potomac. And in fact, and years later, I saw movies, and so this alleged murder of Colby, essentially in his backyard, front yard. I remember in a movie they fictionalized account of his abduction and murder, and so anyway, so it definitely, I think as Greer said, it was a shudder went through D.C. when Colby died that way, and Greer said that Colby's widow never bought the official explanation. Um, so Ralph ended up in Vietnam there in October, and by December, Ralph had finally figured it out. And what it came down to is Ralph wasn't one of the good guys, but he was there. He had a lot. He realized how much blood he had on his hands, and Ralph, in fact, Ralph never got over the smell. He would smell burning flesh that had been napalmed, and he saw photographs of Vietnamese children who had been napalmed by the United States, and Ralph said it destroyed him. And in his quarters one evening in December of '68, there in Saigon, um, he wept like a baby, and thought about killing himself in protest of what the CIA was doing. But he quickly realized that it would be only a futile act. He was thought about staging some big spectacular suicide. But he knew they'd just be covered up. He'd be portrayed as crazy or whatever. And then the CIA would withhold the death benefits from his family. So they take vengeance on his family for it, too. So what Ralph did is he decided he'd just stay quiet, keep doing his job, but he would eventually tell the world one day what the CIA really was and what it did. But he was in Vietnam for a couple more years. And then in 1970, he went home, a ruined man. Yeah, he said he was just thoroughly destroyed by his experience, and he realized that the 18 years of his career was basically a big lie, you know, uh, leading to the slaughter of millions of people, etc., on behalf of corporate America. But he was trapped, and so the way it worked to the CIA back then was if Ralph wanted to change careers, he couldn't even put his CIA employment on a resume. He was stuck. And he had a couple kids in college and stuff, and he had 4 children, and yeah, he was stuck at the CIA. And so, in fact, after he came back from Vietnam, he wanted to live somewhere where he could stand living. Yeah, it wasn't too high in the United States at the time, so he actually asked for another tour of Thailand, which they granted him, and he saw the devastation. So, in fact, Vietnam and Thailand in the early '60s, he had seen these really quiet nations, people peacefully living their lives. And by the late 60s, it was those nations were destroyed. And yeah, it was all back to the school where his children happily attended, the grammar school there, in the first in Thailand. When he returned, that school had barbed wire around it, and students were searched as they entered the school. And that's how much Thailand had changed in the, the United States' fight against communism. So then, not too long after that, so Ralph ended up going back to the United States, and he spent his last years at Langley. In fact, he was John Stockwell. Mentioned wrote a book, and he mentioned people like Ralph who were basically these zombies who like just trudged through the halls there at Langley because they were case officers and people who had been abroad. They came back and they realized that they weren't the good guys, but they were stuck in their careers, and most of them would just drink themselves into a stupor each night and count their days of retirement. And they were not enthusiastic asses of the CIA after that, but they were stuck. And so they just counted their days of their retirement, drinking themselves into a stupor every evening. Ralph, what he did though, was he decided he was going to spend his last years getting educated in its archives in preparation to write his eventual book. And in fact, Ralph actually got kind of lucky. So again, I mentioned those Church and Pike Committee hearings that Colby testified at. During all that, I mean, again, the CIA was exposed like it hasn't been before or since. And suddenly the CIA was offering early retirement to any employees who had spent at least 5 years abroad and had at least 25 years in which Ralph checked the boxes. So Ralph leapt at the opportunity for early retirement. In fact, he received a Career Achievement Medal from the CIA, which typical of their intelligence competence. The medal thanks him for his sterling work in Malaysia, which Ralph had never even been to. So this is how incompetent it all was. But he got his Career Achievement Medal and went to acquire retirement and spent the next few years writing his memoir. And when he did, he actually, and the way it worked was that when you start the CIA, you have to sign these agreements, kind of like an NDA, but you basically are not going to reveal any state secrets, et cetera. And if you ever write anything for the public, the CIA gets to review it and vet it. And so Ralph, and he was, again, Ralph had been awakened, so he had a pretty idea what he was in for. So before he submitted his manuscript, he got an ACLU attorney with the security clearance so he could represent Ralph. And so he submitted his manuscript to the CIA. And anyway, then he got a friendly phone call from the CIA some weeks later, as I recall. And they said, "Oh, Ralph, come on in. We just have a few questions for you." And Ralph said, "That's good, but I'm also going to bring my ACLU attorney with me." I think it was Mark Lynch, maybe. Anyway, I'm bringing my attorney with me. And he said that the CIA on the other end, he kind of groaned when Ralph said that because they were trying to ambush him. And so when Ralph got there with his attorney, he was in a room full of attorneys, huge table, a room full of attorneys. They were going to try to ambush Ralph. Well, that didn't work out. And so then began a 2-year epic legal battle for Ralph to publish his book. And they never give him the runaround. Yeah, they would strike out certain passages. In fact, the first one they did, they blanked out almost this whole book, And but when it turned out that Ralph had competent counsel and stuff, and then it became then it got the attorneys got involved. Then it was just a battle over every sentence, and the CIA would try to erase again. Literally, the CIA was good at trying to make sure that nobody would ever be critical publicly of the CIA. Only a few people have ever done it who worked there. Literally, there was another guy he knew, Ralph had known during his career, who was assigned to work with Ralph. And the first meeting, this set the tone of it. The guy told Ralph that Ralph was lucky that he didn't work for Israeli intelligence because they just take him back out and shoot him. that was his buddy, the CIA. Gee, Ralph, we would like to murder you, but we can't. Yeah, this was anyway. So and Ralph was like this ex football player and stuff. So he was ready to kick butt himself. So anyway, it was quite a battle for 2 years. And in fact, the final book is riddled with censorship deletions. And in fact, and then when it got published, the CIA actually went to bookstores and bought it off the shelves to try to limit its circulation. In fact, Ralph eventually wrote that. He said, again, he was the fourth. There were only in the 20th century, there were only four ex-employees who wrote critical memoirs, and only two did it legally. Victor Marchetti was the first, and Ralph was the second, and there were Phil Agee and John Stockwell. These are the only four guys who did this. And Stockwell and Agee, though, didn't go through the legal ringer to get the approval. And so they had, in fact, the CIA got all the royalties for Stockwell's book, beat him in court. Agee had to actually, he couldn't live in the United States after that. He ended up on the run in Europe, etc. But Ralph didn't want to flee the country or lose his pension, etc. So he played the game. So he did. And then once he got the book published, he did start doing speaking tours and this kind of stuff. In fact, he was on Bill Moyer's Secret Government. He was in he was in that show. He was on that show for a few minutes. Marchetti. And so this thing where, so I'll get this a little later, but Marchetti, he was the one actually who revealed that the Office of Naval Intelligence had a fake defector program back in the 50s that Lee Harvey Oswald was almost certainly a part of. Yeah, Oswald was a fake defector. Yeah, and again, and as my readers know, I know that Oswald did not shoot Jack Kennedy. He was in a backfire CIA operation, which I don't think I ever discussed that with Ralph. I don't think I ever did. And also Marchetti, he wrote an article on the UFO issue and how the UFO issue in the halls of the CIA is not something that was ridiculed, etc. It was an issue. So the CIA was well aware, and Marchetti said it was definitely one of the deep undercover, deep black kind of things around the CIA, around the UFO issue. And I said, my friend who was given an underground exotic technology show, my guess is that most of it was reverse engineered ET stuff, ET technology, which the CIA was probably involved with. But those four guys, it was a rough ride. So yeah, it was not, the CIA made it almost impossible to write critical memoirs. And Ralph wrote about that in his book. And in fact, Ralph, he wrote that the CIA was really not an intelligence agency at all. It was a covert action arm of the American presidency. In fact, Ralph called the CIA an unsalvageable organization and advocated its abolition. And I said, I don't think I talked to Ralph about the CIA's role in the JFK hit. I'm not sure it would have surprised Ralph by then. And again, I've written about this, talked about it, where one of my close relatives was a CIA contract agent who worked for Henry Kissinger. But he was alive when I knew Ralph, and so I never disclosed to people anything about my relative until after he was dead. And so he was not dead when I knew Ralph. So never talked to Ralph about that. But again, I'm sure Ralph would not have been surprised. Yeah, so Ralph was in the civil service aspect of it. So I think he had a GS-13, I think, a rating, with a pension and a salary, et cetera. And there's this whole other covert action arm, which is run by contract agents and off the books and stuff, the real spook stuff. Yeah, so Ralph really didn't play the spook game, like my relative did. He wasn't out there killing people and this kind of stuff. But once Ralph did get his book published in 1983, then he started doing talk circuits, discussing his work. And he really hit the trail. And then he started something called CIA Base, which I linked to. The final version's out there. I linked to it, which was basically exposing the CIA activities with public domain sources. Yeah, so Ralph basically had to stay away from anything that was classified. And so he played the game, but he exposed the CIA using unclassified, publicly available stuff. And in fact, when his book was going through the process of getting approved by the CIA. The CIA actually tried to reclassify previously declassified documents to thwart Ralph. And so literally, so Ralph was using public domain stuff that's been declassified, and the CIA actually tried to reclassify stuff that was in Ralph's book to prevent him from publishing it. And that was a new horizon and spookdom. Yeah, reclassifying information is already out there. Believe it or not. So anyway, so Ralph was busy, and so in 1990, when the beginning of my days of study, again, actually, I mentioned previously where I had bought an issue of Covert Action. In fact, back then it was called Covert Action Information Bulletin, and in there was an ad. Again, there was a list of books they had to sell. One of them was Ralph's book, so I bought it. And again, the introduction of Ralph's books is very moving. It's about his moment of truth there in Saigon when he realized that he'd been living a lie for the previous 15 years. And several, but it was dry reading. After that, it was pretty dry reading. And after several chapters, I put it aside in my pile next to my bed. But I remember looking at that book going, I probably should finish that book. So I tried to finish books when I started reading them. And so, so I did. And so I eventually read the rest of the book. And am I ever glad I did? Because it was one of the most influential books I ever read. So, when I stopped reading, it hadn't gotten to his moment of truth there in Saigon when he realized, and again, and in his days in Thailand when he came up with the wrong answer, which is the peasants like communists. So, so that was a hugely influential book to me. And, Ralph, again, he was a Boy Scout. I'm a Boy Scout. Ralph was essentially a Boy Scout, which is, I think, why I got it. I think it takes one to know one. So Ralph went through this process of disillusionment like I did, like Dennis did. Like, again, the people in my pantheon, most of them went through something like this, where they started out as Boy Scout true believers, and then their experiences woke them up to the reality. Dennis almost killed himself. Ralph thought of killing himself. I didn't. I wanted to kill other people. So anyway, this is that's a rough way to wake up, as you go through it like that. So Ralph is what I call a classic disillusioned idealist. Yeah, so Ralph was gung-ho Cold War until 16 years in, he finally woke up and smelled the coffee. And there are many. So again, my pantheon is like they're similar paths. Brian O'Leary, Rodney Stitch, they have all a similar path to where there are these Boy Scout true believers to eventually their experiences woke them up to realize that it was a lie. It was an illusion that they were being sold. And anyway, so Ralph's book, but Ralph's really the first book like that I encountered, which was like this long, slow awakening process. When, again, he has his career's greatest success, but he came up with the wrong answer. So the CIA suppressed it. So, and those are my early days of study. And so that was that was a really super influential book for me in my early days of study. And then again, I was studying everything. And I've started that series of posts, but I mean, I'm going to get into my days of studying what I learned. That's going to be a lot of that's coming. But 6 years after I read Ralph's book, I wrote my first website back there in the autumn of 1996. And I remember I wrote 40 pages in one day. I wrote 400 pages in a month. And my original website was 600 pages of text. And I remember writing 40 pages in a day. And this was long before I had an editor, etc., which was a wonderful experience to get one. Yeah, this was I was still in the early stages of learning how to write publicly. And I wrote a summary, though, of Ralph's journey. Back in the 400 pages was like, I don't know, 5-6 pages or something of my summary of Ralph's journey and Ralph's book. And in those days, in the innocent days of the internet, Ralph was easy to find on the internet. So I found Ralph and his email address, and I emailed him, and I asked him for permission to publish it. And he came back with, yeah, you have my permission. So anyway, and that was it. So I published it. And then the next year, actually, my site came down, 97, with no warning. I had no internet presence for actually more than a year. And but in 98, I began writing the essays that became my site. My first ones were an essay on Julian Simon and his stable of environmental deniers, uh, and Christopher Columbus and fluoride. And as I started publishing my new site, as I started publishing the site, large as it stands today, actually, I looked to see what of my work might have survived on the internet. And actually, one person had reproduced my entire site. My entire site was out there, original site, long gone today, but it was out there back in '98. And then and other pieces of my work had survived. People have been publishing around the internet, but the one that surprised me is that my several page summary of Ralph's book and his journey, that was in a bunch of places, several places. I saw it in several places on the internet, and I was like, huh, what happened? I mean, somebody did, so I didn't know what had happened. And there was one site that was run by a former spook. In fact, he became this lefty spook. In fact, there were a lot of prominent lefty kind of people that were involved in his site, etc. So it was kind of like this. Again, this is in '98, and anyway, so I contacted this guy. I said, "So where did you get that summary of Ralph McGehee's book from?" And he surprisingly said he thought he got it from Ralph. So anyway, so I was surprised by that, and I contacted Ralph, and I said, "Is that were you the guy?" And Ralph, he was the guy. So Ralph had considered my hastily written, 5-page summary to be the defining summary of his work. Others had written, Ralph had written about a lot, but he thought my summary was the best out there. In fact, when I talked to him once, and he's like, that was the best he'd ever seen. In fact, I actually wrote, when he told me that, it was a hurriedly written thing, and so 2 years later, I actually took more care and wrote what I considered a better version. And I showed Ralph. I said, "Here's a better version of what I heard," and I put it on my site then. So I revived. I created a page for Ralph, and he was deeply moved by that. And not only I was deeply honored by Ralph's reaction, but it was also really the first time that I got confirmation I was doing justice to the topics that I wrote about. Yeah, so this kind of feedback, and this was the first of, I got a lot of feedback, I guess, over the years. It was like, okay, I get from the people I'm writing about, and they're going, okay, you're doing justice to these topics. And so, but Ralph was the first. Ralph was the first time indicator I got that I was doing a good job writing about this stuff. And that's where our friendship began. So back in '98, our friendship began, and we interacted quite a bit. Again, Ralph was running his CIA base at the time, and back then, I was just beginning to. Actually, this is before I did. So before I published my site as it exists today, I was writing letters to the editor. In fact, I did it in Ohio, and I did it in Seattle, and I wrote the letters to the editor of the Seattle Times and then published them. So I would always get my letters published. And in 1998, early '98, I predicted something like the 9/11 terror attacks because of what we were doing to Iraq. And Ralph, I showed it to him, and he was amazed that the Seattle Times would run a letter like that. Yeah, I essentially predicted something like the 9/11 terror attacks in this letter to the editor as understandable retaliation by the people in the Islamic world. And Ralph wrote that the East Coast papers would never publish something like that. So on the West Coast, I was able to get something published like that. And Ralph was pretty amazed that in the United States, a mainstream newspaper would run a letter like that. And I remember the next year, 1999, I was in the March, so the WTO meeting, the infamous WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999, the night before it began, I was in a peace march. Well, actually, it was a march it was a 2000 Jubilee thing where it was trying to forgive third world debt. And I was marching next to priests and nuns. And in fact, I met the former Washington governor who beat the gangster attorney general who ran Dennis out of the state. And I remember that night, the next night became martial law with the tear gas, etc. And Ralph was watching, and we were trading email as Ralph was watching martial law in Seattle. And this is again a couple years before 9/11. And it was highly unusual to see, again, that scene of martial law being called in a city like that. Yeah, Natchez hadn't seen that probably since the 60s. And so it was very unusual. Today it's pretty normal, but back then it was really unusual to see the martial law being declared in a city like Seattle. And so Ralph and I, we communicated a lot in those days. And he sent me his commentary. He would comment on current events, and he had a once in a while he tried to have a be funny. Once in a while he would take his try to hand a little sarcastic sense of humor or irony. He tried to be ironic sometimes. But Ralph was harassed by the CIA and friends there, where he lived in Herndon again, right in the shadow of Langley, and he was harassed all the time. In fact, I published some of this. In fact, unfortunately, I had a long ugly story, but I lost all of my email, etc., for a couple year period. And so pretty much, so when Ralph and I were interacting a lot, I lost it all. I only a few emails survived after that. And I published one of those where Ralph, he wrote to me how he was being harassed by the CIA and friends. And he was, maybe he get, anonymous phone calls in the night threatening his family. And the local police, so they apparently used Ralph is like training. So the CIA would work with the local police to harass Ralph. And he couldn't go down the street without him being tailed by these goons. And in fact, and the worst part for me, if Ralph's reporting, was how the local merchants there were all in on it. So yeah, so these goons, police and CIA would go to various stores and say, "Be on the lookout for this guy. If he's there, give him hell." And so Ralph was getting constantly harassed, etc. In fact, they spiked his food. He got injured by what the local merchants were doing. And that was really, to me, that was the most disgusting part of it. Spooks, goon cops, I get it. But all these merchants gleefully signed up to harass Ralph. Yeah, he couldn't he couldn't do anything in town without being harassed by the local merchants and stuff. Yeah, it was really, yeah, really terrible. And this is an example of what I call 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. Yeah, so all these merchants and stuff, they were criminals. They were criminally harassing Ralph for speaking out on what the CIA is, what it does. And so by 2000, in 2000, Ralph had turned 72 in 2000, and Ralph had had enough. So he was getting old. In fact, he had to have a knee replaced. And he decided he was going to close down his CIA base, sell his house, sell until his retirement, retire to Florida to be closer to some of his children, as I recall. And in fact, I could have actually bought his intelligence library. He had a 1,000 volume intelligence library, and I actually was interested in buying it, but kind of glad I didn't. I already got thousands of books, so another 1,000 books. I don't know what I've done with them all these years. But I ended up buying. So when I got Lives of Our Time, in fact, Ralph, I saw his work, Lives of Our Times. He actually wrote an article on Lives of Our Times with Ed Herman, editor for. And actually, I bought his issues of Lives of Our Times before I subscribed. So I didn't subscribe till the autumn of 1990, but it began in the winter of spring of 1990. So I bought those issues from Ralph. In fact, Memento, yeah. So his mailing address is on there, et cetera. So one of my mementos of Ralph. But he actually essentially gave it, selling it's too generous a term. I think he sold it for like $500 or something, his intelligence library to university there near DC. And that was probably a good home for it, so they got Ralph's intelligence library. And then Ralph was done. He said, "Hey, he's going to retire to the sun in Florida." And I mentioned he had to have a knee replaced. And then, again, back to those national championship days of Notre Dame, Ralph, in fact, it was when I talked to him. So I talked to him on the phone, which was coming. And I brought this up, actually, I believe. So Ralph, he attended the 50th anniversary ceremony at a Notre Dame game for the members of the national championship teams. And Ralph got his knee replaced. He had to have a knee replaced back then. And he mentioned that when I brought this up about his football days, did that. And he said, "Oh, yeah." because when he was there at this 50th anniversary ceremony, there were all these, the guys who had lived that long, football players, and he said it was canes and walkers and wheelchairs. Yeah, not too many of those guys were actually still standing on their own back then. So the price of football. Yeah, so Ralph paid that price of being a football star. So in 2001, Ralph sold his home in Herndon and moved to Florida. And our correspondence really tailed off. Ralph was like, I'm done. And I hear from, again, we didn't trade much email in those days because Ralph was like, wait, I'm done. I'm like, okay, fine. Until one day in August of 2001, I got this email from Ralph, begging for help. And he actually asked me for my fax number, and where I worked at the time. I said I gave him a fax number, so he faxed to me a letter from the CIA, which was this letter from the CIA that actually said that his CIA-based activities and other activities did not violate national security because he was not divulging classified information. And Ralph informed me that when he moved to this new neighborhood down there in Florida, the FBI immediately showed up and started telling all of Ralph's neighbors that there was this great national security threat to move their neighborhood. Yeah, and so Ralph was, and what he had endured there in D.C. and Herndon, he was almost afraid to leave his home. They're going to frame him for something. That's that. Yeah, in fact, in Herndon, they were trying to frame Ralph for shoplifting, all this kind of crazy stuff. And so, anyway, so Ralph asked me to publish that on my site, on my essay, and I did, and it's still there today, so people can see that. And so I published that, and then Ralph, he actually wrote to me that took the FBI's heat off of him, which I don't know if Ralph was being generous or not. I'm surprised that would have done it, but he wanted me to do it, so I did it. And so, Ralph thought that the FBI stopped bothering him after that. Okay. And so happy to have helped Ralph. And so, anyway, but a month later was 9/11 terror attacks. And after the 9/11 terror attacks, it was hazardous for your health to be a critic of American foreign policy. So Ralph just tried to disappear. Ralph, again, he'd already retired, but he's like, I don't. In fact, Ralph, even I saw somebody else who published this stuff, and Ralph contacted them and say, please take down everything about me on your site. Ralph never did that with me, so I left up my summary of Ralph, my site, my 5-page summary or something. That will outlive me. And so, but Ralph was he wanted a low profile. And so, in fact, I think that's about the time I called him. I think it was soon after 9/11 when I did call him. We had about an hour-long conversation. And again, during that conversation, Ralph said that, yeah, my summary was the best he'd seen of his work. And again, I'm happy it was worthy of Ralph. And so I just wanted to do justice to Ralph's heroic journey. Yeah, very heroic journey, the kind that I have not encountered very often. Yeah, so Ralph just wanted to be left alone after the 9/11. And then his wife died. So several years later, his wife died, and then the last several years of Ralph's life, he was alone. In fact, he moved up to Maine to be back close to his family there. And in fact, he died during COVID. Yeah, so he died in 2020 of COVID. And so that's when I learned he died. So it was national news when Ralph died. He was a very prominent CIA critic. And I actually got in contact with his family, and I'm still in contact with Ralph's family, which I'm happy about that. And so, I loved Ralph. Ralph was a great man, and many case officers had, to one degree or another, the kind of awakening that Ralph did have. Yeah, you couldn't do what Ralph was doing for that long without having some kind of realization of what was really going on. Even if the CIA was trying to hire people like who would blindly follow orders and not think about the blood on their hands. But in fact, Stockwell wrote about this, where these case officers would come back from a stint abroad, shocked, and they knew that they were not the good guys. But again, like Ralph, they were trapped. They couldn't change careers, and so Langley was filled with these zombies that sort of like walk through the halls, stumbling through the halls, counting their days to retirement. So for every 1,000 zombies, probably there was a Ralph who was not going to just stay quiet. And I mean, he did that, but then he was preparing to expose the CIA. So again, to speak up about it. Ralph was, again, only a handful have done that, who have woken up and spoken out about it, and this is what I found out. All the rackets, they're all like this. And so very few people are going to wake up and speak out. Ralph was one of the very few. Courageous, heroic quest. And again, for me, in fact, Dennis Lee, same kind of thing, where these idealists, these Boy Scouts who go in with all these ideals and they're used by the system to kill people, etc., on behalf of their tribe or their nation or whatever. And then they eventually realized that it was all a lie. And they were not the good guys. They had this blood on their hands. And then to decide to have this conscience that was not going to just, be denied. And so then they were going to try to do something to right the scales, to right their scales, to actually make amends for what they had been a part of and to try to prevent this stuff from happening in the future. Very few humans have what it takes to do that. Ralph was one of the few. Very heroic what Ralph did. And again, a man of conscience. Not many like Ralph on the planet today. And if we're going to survive as a species, more of us have to find the kind of courage that Ralph had, or be inspired enough by what Ralph did, is to help me sing and help the fifth epic come into reality. The technology is older than I am. So I don't ask anybody to be as heroic as Ralph was. I need a much lower level for what I'm doing, which is just wake up and speak out and sing the song of abundance with me. That's what I need. Could Ralph have done that with me? I don't know. It's like he was on the CIA track. I get that. But anyway, Ralph's journey and his book and stuff was definitely one of the key moments during my process of awakening, a process of understanding. And Ralph has my eternal gratitude for that journey, and for teaching me how the world really works. So R.I.P. Ralph. That was it been 6 years now, just about. Yeah, about 6 years. So one of my heroes. So anyway, that's all for now.